All right. Good morning, everyone. It's CJ, and we are live. Welcome to another edition of Rogue Mornings. So I'm very excited to be delivering another show. It's Wednesday already. This week is quickly flying by. I am also delighted to share that today I'll be joined by London Paul of the Series Report. So, Paul, good morning. Thank you so much for joining.
Well, good morning, CJ. Yeah, it's a pleasure. I mean, while V's away, it's better to do the sort of morning show with someone else, I think,
It's kind of boring talking to
rather,
yourself, Paul.
yeah, yeah. Mind you, as long as you don't start answering yourself, you'll be fine.
Exactly. That's when you have to worry is when you start giving the answers to the questions you ask. So, yeah, real quick before we jump into it, I do want to also thank our show sponsors, MyCB Edibles. Go to mycbedibles.com, learn about all the delicious CBD products. Also, Remain Calm. If you're in the need of either collection problems, make sure to visit remaincalm.net. And also the Crypto School. I'll get with the crypto guys today and see if they want to go on and do a live show later on today. So I will reach out to them later on. So the Crypto School that you can find on the link on Remain Calm, and then also Liquid Base if you need to holding a certain amount of crypto and you want to need to liquidate. Find out about the ways that Liquid Base can help you at liquidbase.io. So Paul, let's jump into it. There's a lot to discuss today, as always. And before we went live, we shared a little bit around what most of the headlines are carrying nationally, and that's to do with this Amorosa, this former apprentice star turned president, presidential advisor. What say you?
Yeah, I think it's just another example. It's just a huge, gigantic distraction from. I mean, yeah, someone's got a book to publicize, so they're gonna come out and try and make the headlines, but it's just an utter distraction from what from the reality of what needs to be dealt with in the US. And it makes great media headlines, and I think Trump's come back with some plumbing tweets, and it really probably would have been best just to have ignored it and rather than sort of respond to it, because it's a 5-day wonder. It'll be all forgotten, and then we'll kind of move obviously onto something else in the process. But yeah, it's just symptomatic of Trump's presidency that all these issues seem to overshadow the important matters that you know the mainstream media just doesn't really want to address, and that's really the most damning, I think, indictment of the whole affair.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah Sanders Huckabee. If I butcher the name, I apologize. But I do know it's Sanders Huckabee somewhere in there. Sarah Sanders Huckabee. But she made a valid point, and her point was this, Paul, was that isn't it kind of funny how while Omarosa was a White House advisor, that no one paid her any mind at all, right? Like she was, completely ignored. No one paid any attention. But now that she's left the White House and she's out on the media stumping for her new book and promoting it and talking all these things about Trump said this, Trump said that. They are giving her all the attention in the world. And this, again, I think is going to, it's blowback on the media. People get this. People understand it. The dying legacy media at one time would like to believe that they could do this and it's going to electrify the electorate. It's going to change people's minds. But those days have passed, Paul. I think that people see right past this of what it is of her just promoting this book without factual. I guess the president came out said I did not use the N word back in the days of The Apprentice. I did not use that word. And the White House came out and said Sarah Sanders said she cannot confirm that. But regardless, there's a lot more important things. So, but unfortunately, it's things like this that just grip the national attention for a while. There is one thing that I would say, and this goes back to a little bit around the administration, something back to my hiring days, Paul, is that we're accountable for who we hire and who we bring aboard. So I think this more, not that I'm going to take the opportunity to slam the president about it, but this also kind of reveals, again, systematic decisions on who he brings in the inner circles as advisors and why he chooses to do those things. So hopefully he learns from this and he's very selective on his next White House advisors that move in. There's a lot more people with a lot better credentials that could give a lot better advice than someone that was on The Apprentice.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, I mean, without bashing Trump too much in this regard, we've talked about this pretty much since he became president. Or I first show we did was January 2017, so it was after before his inauguration. But since then, he's made a lot of, I think, appointments that are ill-advised, and that's being polite. I mean, and not just necessarily in the inner circle. I don't know whether Bolton's part of the inner circle or isn't, but I mean, people like that, I think it's questionable as to why he's employed certain people in roles, and when it's very obviously very detrimental. But in this case, it's someone in the inner circle. You have to be absolutely certain that you have 100% loyalty, and and if someone leaves, that whatever's discussed inside the four walls of the Oval Office or wherever else stays there. I mean, you have to rely on those people, and if you're getting people who don't do that for whatever reason, and in the process, we don't know to what extent she sensationalized things for a book. I have no way of knowing, and we can't really discuss that. But anyway, it just doesn't reflect well in terms of his choice. But I think you absolutely make the valid point that in the end, the US people are just going to sit there and go, we're just fed up of this. I think more and more. In fact, if anything, it's getting more people to want to vote for Trump because they're fed up of this endless bashing. And if they can't get him to do with Russiagate, they're going to try and rake up something else in the process. And it's damaged the mainstream media. I think they've done more damage to themselves than even Trump's done. But I think Trump, one of those things, he threw the hand grenade, walked out, and the whole thing's blown up in their face in the process. So, of course, it's like, crying wolf once too often. I think in the end, people are saying, we're just sick to death of this. I mean, if there's a problem with Trump and there's a major issue, then, fair enough. But I mean, if you're just going to have this kind of media speculation all the time, the truth is, if there ever was something, I think people have got to the point they just wouldn't take any notice of it in the main. I mean, you're always going to get people who are very pro-Democrat or pro-whatever, a particular persuasion is, and they're always going to look for any opportunity to lambast Trump. But I think in the process that it'd be interesting to know just how many people were sort of sitting on the fence during the Trump administration and now kind of got on the basis of all this have gone, actually, I think we might kind of move towards the, more in sympathetic with Trump. And I have, in the course of being on Twitter over the last 6 months, particularly, seen people who said, I was a Democrat, now I've moved over to the Trump side because I'm fed up of what's gone on. So, yeah, in a way, I think they've kind of cut off the nose to spite their face in the process. But yeah, it's just best one of those things, just move on. And Trump really also should just largely ignore it and not, sort of waste time getting involved in some spat on Twitter with someone. Just let them have their 5 minutes in the limelight and they'll very quickly disappear and everyone moves on. But I think sometimes when Trump responds, it's not really how a president should conduct himself, I think. Call me old-fashioned.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I agree. I think that there's better words that could have been chosen than to call someone a dog. I think.
Yeah. I mean, that's just completely ridiculous to do that. He should never have resorted to that. Yeah, he may have disagreements, but there's far, far more appropriate ways of phrasing it. But anyway.
Yeah, very unprofessional. If she did sign a non-disclosure agreement, which most people do any type of going into, especially with politics, right? As far as releasing strategies and everything else on her, he very could have pointed that back at her to say, look at where's her guiding principles? Where's her guiding principles to sign a legal document that she would not disclose any of this information? What is she doing? She's out profiting for it. She's out there writing a book strictly profiting for her financial benefit gain versus the care to the American people of truly what needs to be done, causing a major distraction to this administration. He could have very easily went with that narrative and probably politically, although I don't like scoring political points, but I think it would have came across a lot better versus calling someone a dog.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit because something that a whole lot of conversation didn't take place, Paul, and that's the military spending bill that was recently signed. Looks like Trump signed the $716 billion military spending bill. That 716 is with a B, billion.
Yes.
After Congress passed the bill earlier this month, President Trump on Monday signed the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, which it was kind of funny that Congress moved forward and they called it the John McCain National Defense Authorization, just to try to get Trump to thank John McCain, and he didn't. Anyway, I'm sorry to make fun of that, but that's what the media focused on, Paul.
Yeah, but again, it's another example. Yeah, I mean, he just, I mean, it's obvious there's no love lost between McCain and Trump. I think that's pretty obvious. But yeah, it's one of those things that, I mean, we spoke about this previously, and there's a strange irony in the U.S. economy that if you slash defense spending, the U.S. goes into recession.
Yeah,
and this has happened throughout history. And of course, yeah, because the huge amount of money spent in military term and also in arms sales, etc., etc. So I think the thing that's kind of interesting, of course, Trump made this big thing about wanting to create this space force, but there was apparently no money's been earmarked in this spending bill for that. And I think, someone asked me about what did I think about this, and I said, well, if the US manages to ever achieve anything, I mean, I think it's one of those projects. A lot of money will get spent, and then you'll look back and go, well, was it money well spent? And of course, that's never the case with the so-called military-industrial complex. But I made the point that if the US does actually create a space force, that the Chinese and Russians will have a welcoming party for them when they get up there, because of course they already have a presence in that regard, which so that will be a bit of, and I think that's why they're trying to join the space race as well, or whatever, space weapons or whatever, because yeah, the Chinese and the Russians already have a space force, as Trump refers to it. I mean, there is some interesting things where it talks about, trying to grasp the issue of providing arms for terrorists in Syria and the like. And of course, this has been a huge problem because undoubtedly in the war in Syria, as time's gone by and more of Syria has been liberated, particularly the south recently, the amount of Western and US weapons and Israeli weapons, for that matter, that were found with Daesh operatives, etc., is perhaps not surprising, but it's a huge problem. And there's the argument, well, were they being armed directly or was it indirectly? Because at times the US will arm nations, and then they go and sell the arms on the black market, and they end up, in the hands of terrorists in the end. So there's various ways they can end up with it. But yeah, there needs to be far better scrutiny as to how weapons are sold and who they're sold to. And I think in a way it's something we've spoken about, and I've spoken about to podcast subscribers for a long time, that the US is looking for ways to get out of the likes of Syria and get out of, and Yemen's another. It's a Vietnam for Saudi Arabia, and indirectly it's not a Vietnam for the US, but their involvement is getting more and more, questionable. And of course, all these ugly events where the Saudis seem to be targeting civilian targets and then going, oh, well, actually it was a mistake. And, bombing schools and countless other places in the process. And the US is going, well, actually, we're going to have to look at getting out of this mess. And why did we ever get involved in the first place? So there are some positives in that regard, but it comes back to the point is that I think to some extent, there was a belief, and perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, but during the Obama administration, not so much necessarily the military spending, but certainly there was a lot of very disgruntled military personnel with regards to campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly, and what went on. And I think the Obama administration was deeply unpopular, and Trump came in saying, well, I want to address that. The military has a lot of inferior equipment, and, we're going to have this huge spending spree in terms of updating hardware and providing better, I think, pension facilities and also better treatment of veterans, which I know was a big problem and always perceived to be a big problem in the Obama administration. But I think overall it's still a ridiculous amount to be spent. And we said yesterday a lot of that money would be better spent on infrastructure which would benefit all Americans in the process, rather than, I think there's, in a way, Trump's trying to appease the military and keep them on side and doesn't want to lose face with them. But in the process, I think at times he's, they made some bad decisions, and I think in retrospect, the missile attack, which was largely thwarted in Syria after the complete false flag chemical weapons attack in Douma, was an example where it was acted in haste and repent at leisure, and they made some big mistakes. And I don't think the military are exactly thrilled about that, but they're never going to complain about a large military budget. And in the end, of course, it is true, if you slash the budget, the US economy is going to suffer. I mean, it's kind of a bit of a perverse thing to say, but that's, if you look back through history, that's what happens. But, I think, there's also part in the bill, there was some elements where they were saying they were going to force the military into better reporting of aspects of the wars to Congress. I think there does need to be better, a liaison between what the military are doing in Congress. And I also think there needs to be some more input where I don't think it's a good idea that, that necessarily that Trump makes a decision, we're just going to go in and launch missiles. And, there needs to be some congressional approval in terms of military action. But then there again, we need to make sure that the balance is right, and also that Congress is doing the job it's supposed to be doing, and the Senate, and of course we know largely that is not the case, even though there's been some improvement through the Trump administration. I mean, and it does say, past reporting requirements were largely not complied with, and they've addressed those in this NDAA. So I think there's some positives in it, but once again, it's whether they're actually implemented. It's all well and good writing them, and then people pay lip service. Trump signs off this bill, and then no one implements any of it. But certainly, from my impression I've got over the last year or so, is that Trump, he wants to have, a first class military, but not to have bases all around the world, and not to be fighting pointless wars that have cost the US trillions of dollars over decades and have achieved absolutely nothing. I mean, Afghanistan's a great example of that in that regard. And then it's the huge loss of civilian life. It's the loss of military personnel, which has been very damaging, morale damaging to the military in the process. And I think they're the important lessons. And then the other lessons need to be is don't embark on projects like the F-35 where you wasted basically $1 trillion and nothing. It's never flown in a combat mission, and there's repeatedly problems with it. We've had problems with US missile defense systems as well, and the list goes on and on. So the question is, there needs to be, if you're going to spend the money, and then spend it wisely and spend it in a way that there is some benefit in doing so. I mean, the Russians particularly have proved that, and the Chinese are now starting to demonstrate that they've spent money wisely, and they spent a fraction, of course, of what the US spends militarily. So I think that there are some important lessons to be learned in that regard. But I mean, I think, part of me thinks it's a great photo opportunity for Trump to be seen with military personnel signing off this bill, and it certainly appeals to a sector of the US population in that regard, and I can see partly why he's done it. But I think underneath it all, he does recognise that the US's days of having this enormous, almost war machine across the world, those days are coming to an end, and rightly so, because it's an utter waste of US, taxpayers' money in funding all these bases everywhere, and there's absolutely no need to have them, as we know.
Yeah, excellent points, Paul. I agree. There's, I think in terms of pro-military, pro-individuals, I don't think you're going to find another president that's been more supportive of our men and women in uniform. And I would like to think that, hopefully somewhere at some point that, we can own up to the responsibility that, we do have a significant amount of veterans that come back home. They drop out of the military, or they de-enlist, or they service out their time. They end up homeless, perhaps. Also, the issues with the veterans care, and then also the massive amount of the suicide rate that's affecting our veterans with their mental health. So I think for the most part, we definitely as a country, we can do better than that, and that we should. But as you pointed out in here, in terms of cutting back and a little bit more accountability in terms of some of the funding that we spend in in Syria and Yemen. Those are good items to keep an eye on. Hopefully, we can draw back from some of that funding, but then largely in part understanding that this funding goes directly to these mega corporations that employ a significant amount of people. I don't know what percentage of the U.S. economy is in regards to the military or military industrial complex, but I guarantee you that it's fairly significant in terms of manufacturing. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. But again, great talking points of what we discussed. But in the dying legacy media, they want to focus on the fact that Trump didn't acknowledge John McCain. Let's shift gears a little bit, Paul, because some numbers came out in regards to what's happening with consumer debt levels. And we've specifically, yesterday we talked about the economy, about potentially, the real surface numbers. So I'm getting a little bit trouble understanding that if unemployment is at all times low, if the economy is doing so well, then why is U.S. household debt rising to the massive level in the tune of $13.3 trillion in the second quarter? This is reporting that Americans' borrowing reached $13.29 trillion in the second quarter, up $454 billion from a year ago, marking a 16th consecutive quarter of increases. A New York Federal Reserve report released on Tuesday showed. That's pretty eye-opening, Paul.
Yeah, and I think it's symptomatic, and I know it's the case in the UK that there's a lot of people employed in what would really amount to part-time jobs and earning what we would define as minimum wage here, which really is nobody can actually manage to afford to live on. And certainly it's questionable just the debt that people are going to, never mind sort of, there's a lot of people who take payday loans in the UK at ridiculous interest rates because their, credit rating is so poor they can't get a traditional loan. Not that I'm suggesting they necessarily should anyway, but I think one of the most damning statistics, apart from this ever inflating debt bubble that exists in the US, when it said in the, what you're referring to, when it said the level of US consumer debt was 618 billion higher than the previous peak of 12.68 billion. Note in the third quarter of 2008, which was just at the cusp of the financial crisis. I mean, that's most damning. That in fact, no one's ever addressed the debt problem. It's just got worse. Okay, some people may argue, well, that's not a huge increase from then, but if you go through a financial crisis, you would expect that the debt level shouldn't be actually higher than it was. It should have been significantly lower, and it's not in the process because everything is a debt-fueled economy in Western nations. They also said it was 19.2% above a post-global credit crisis low set in the second quarter of 2013. So it implies, obviously, there was some understanding we have to get this debt level under control. But of course, in the process, that's not happened, and it's just spiraled out of control in the last 5 years. And of course, we know it links to the home, autos or car industry, students and credit loans. And yet they're trying to link it with this idea, like you say, that there's almost full employment in the US. And of course, the argument is, well, everyone can afford this because no one's having any problems, paying back their debt. They can meet all the monthly payments, even though we've had 7 interest rate rises by the Fed in the last 3 years, and they're saying, oh well, delinquencies are pretty low. They're only about not even 2.5%, and the pace of student loans turning seriously delinquent slowing down. So everything's fine. There's nothing to worry about. But if you look at the actual figures, the amount of student loans has grown to 1.4 trillion. In the second quarter, okay, they say it's up 61 billion from a year ago. So the argument is it's starting to slow down. Auto debt's really more or less the same at 1.24 trillion. Credit card debt's gone up, what is it, 2 or 3%, but it's 45 billion, so it's up nearly a billion. And mortgage debt's now 9 trillion and up 300 billion from a year ago. So you could almost argue that in essence, people have just become exhausted with debt, and in fact, there's no room anymore. And part of that is interest rate rises because I don't need necessarily people get locked in the UK into fixed rate mortgages, and you can have fixed rate mortgages for a year, 5 years. So there's now ones for 30 years, whatever. But at some point, the interest rate rises, the debt's going to be passed on, and people who have credit cards, I know in the UK, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in the US, they're never reflective of true interest rate. They're extortionate, the rates they charge. It's 20 odd, 30%, and some are obviously significantly higher than that. So it is this ever-growing debt bubble that's never going to go away. So you have all this consumer debt problem, you have the US debt of 22 trillion, all these unfunded liabilities, which, as we said, is 250, 300, maybe 400 trillion. I don't think anybody actually knows. And yet we're supposed to believe that, that economy's stable. I mean, in any other period in history, if you'd said this, people would have gone, hang on, we're broke. We're a third world economic nation. And yet now debt's, is regarded as the new credit. It's fine. Don't worry. Everyone's in debt. They can pay it all back. But it's an impossibility. I mean, and how much of this debt's going to end up being written off? And what's the consequences of writing off the debt? But I mean, I know that in student debt, you can't write it off. So what happens? I mean, at some point, there's going to be a squeeze, because in the end, it's like here in the UK, there's students with huge debt now. They're never going to be able to afford to buy a house. And, as the population ages, more and more housing comes on the market, there's no one going to be able to afford to buy it. Okay, we're not to that point, but look further down the track. In the end, the housing market's going to grind to a halt. And of course, the other big problem you have is in another 2008 financial crisis, which will be on steroids, then the housing market will collapse. And I can't make any predictions what would happen, but if the housing market falls 40, 50, 60%, I mean, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but in Japan in the late 80s, housing market collapsed 90%. Now, I'm not suggesting that's going to happen, but what happens when you have people with enormous negative equity because the housing market collapses? And then you've got the Feds going, well, actually, we're just going to keep raising interest rates. Yeah, that's the way to resolve it. But because the problem is, in a way, part of the reason for raising interest rates, apart from trying to, they think they can restore some credibility and try and normalize the economy. The other thing is there is rampant inflation. I mean, unemployment's 22, 23%. Inflation's probably 10% or 8% in the US. And I know in this from in the UK, as I've said before, periodically I'll just look at old receipts. I keep them from when you go food shopping, and you can see the price increase of 10% increases and higher in the year in terms of food shopping, and then you've got in terms of bills. I mean, white goods certainly are getting cheaper. I mean, there's no doubt about that, and so there are swings and roundabouts, but predominantly the everyday things that people need to consume to survive and to live are getting more and more expensive, and people's wages. I mean, that's the other thing. Look at the wage increases. They're not meeting with real inflation. And in fact, even with the fudged inflation figures, that's often significantly lower, and people are in relative terms are getting worse and worse off. And then often in the process, it's like we said with a couple of weeks ago with the US GDP figures for Q2, which were, over 4%. The reality is most of that was just consumer debt driven spending. I mean, and that is not, should be discounted from economic figures, because it's not a true reflection of a thriving economy. I mean, people are not spending money they have; they're spending money they don't have and having to pay it back later. And it's just, this mounting debt bubble is just another disaster waiting to happen. Along with, I mean, also it's symptomatic. I mean, I don't know the exact debt figures for the UK, but they're rising. And it's just symptomatic of Western nations, and of course the other thing is anyone who had savings have exhausted them because they've got no interest. They don't get any interest on their savings. People used to get 4 or 5%. I mean, of course, the QE and zero interest rate policy killed that stone debt, and so they don't make. So people who save for retirement are exhausting their savings in the process. And in the UK, if people cease to have any savings, then they're going to become more dependent on the state to get more benefits in retirement to make up the shortfall. So it's just a vicious circle that will never end, and it's just going to end up. I'm not saying, for me, I don't think the auto car industry or any of this, but these sort of bubbles are the thing that's going to bring everything down. But it's another contributory factor that people who are highly indebted can have major problems if we have another 2008 financial crisis, which is an inevitability. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when.
Yes, I mean, just truly amazing to look at this and think of it in the terms of the debt-driven economy that we have, and to see it not only on a consumer base but also on a federal level. Now, this particular article tries to swing that as a good sign, meaning that the economy is doing well, that the employment is great. That's why people are taking on, more debt. But I think it streams specifically back to the fact that these jobs that paid the higher wages, that the economy has shifted quite a bit over the last several years. And Paul, where I also get concerned of this is just in the future. So for any of our listeners that have children, and to think that at some point there's going to be any type of social security programs, any type of those. Now, anyone that's banking their retirement strictly off of social security, probably better wake up anyway. But it's just eye-opening. It's very shocking what that projected. There's only so much debt that can carry on. Now, some economists argue that you have to have debt in order for a currency to be viable. You have to have certain debt. There was a specific tweet that went out. I can't remember who tweeted out that pointed that out. But however, when you look at this massive amount of debt that's basically created out of thin air, and you take a look at whether it's pensions or money in people's bank accounts, is that at some point when this debt load becomes so heavy that these loans cannot be paid off, what happens at that point, Paul? And that's where it gets concerning.
Well, yeah, and it's another example. Everyone had the sort of soundbite of subprime mortgage. Well, subprime mortgage is a worse problem now than it was, and there's also subprime in the auto loans industry and et cetera, et cetera. So subprime is a big problem, and I've heard some incredible stories about students in the US being given mortgages. I mean, I mean, yeah, because it's debt, so don't worry. You've got who knows how much actual student debt. Well, don't worry, just have some more debt. I mean, the problem is that we've been conditioned into almost believing that a massive amounts of debt is a growth a factor in the economy now, and people don't even seem to reflect on the fact that, well, it doesn't matter. So, who cares if there's all this debt? We'll just create more debt because it creates the illusion of prosperity and economic strength. But in the end, of course, there comes a point where nobody's going to have any money to pay for anything, and then literally the economy completely grinds to a halt. And of course, there's always going to be people within who are always never going to suffer. But it's historically, it's the so-called middle class who always get wiped out and that's gone out from history for hundreds of years, from the times of the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution and post-World War I in the UK, and the list goes on and on throughout history. They're always the people who, and increasingly they've sucked more and more people into that band, even though in reality they're not. And they're the ones who are highly leveraged with huge amounts of debt. And of course, when you go through some financial crisis, they're the ones who are going to suffer most and more than anyone. And this is the big problem. It's all well and good while you can keep propping up the illusion, but at some point that illusion is going to break down, and then there's going to be mayhem in the process. And that's the thing none of these political commentators ever talk about. They don't ever talk about the fact that in simple terms, if I'm $200,000 in debt, you don't go, well, here's another $500,000. Don't worry, you can pay off the 200,000. And don't worry, you've got a whole bunch more debt to manage. It's just a nonsense. But common sense has gone out the window, and that's been the case for pretty much the last 10 years or so. We're fast approaching the Lehman event of 2008, and that was the sort of precipitated the whole crisis and the collapse. But this time, in many senses, we're in a far worse shape individually, and of course, Western economies and the banks are in the process. I mean, everything's just bust. So, if anyone really genuinely thinks there's a way out of this, then I'm all ears. But I'm sorry, in reality, it's just not possible.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Great points, Paul. Before we shift gears into this next topic, I do want to let our listeners know that this is pretty disturbing. This information that's coming out. So if you're sensitive around that and you choose not to listen, you may want to drop out of this podcast at this point. The other thing that I want to state is that I firmly believe that if we would have potentially had a different type of administration, that news like this, information like this, prosecutions like this, probably more than likely would have been covered up in the court systems. I don't think that these would be coming to premonition of things that involve. So Paul, we're getting reports. This is reported from Zero Hedge that over 300 Catholic pedos preyed upon 1,000 plus children amid systematic cover-up. A bombshell grand jury from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court concludes that over 300 members of the Catholic clergy molested over 1,000 child victims amid a systematic cover-up by church leaders spanning over the course of 7 decades. In the second major Catholic pedophile scandal this week, following a raid conducted in Chile at the Catholic Episcopal Conference. Now, Paul, I know that the history regarding the Catholic Church, the things that have occurred in this, I did listen to a press conference that was reported. I didn't send you the link, but I did listen to the press conference, and it was just truly disturbing, the criminality of what took place. You're talking about priests impregnating young girls, having them have abortions. The priests would buy jewelry for their victims, specifically gold crosses, to have them wear them so that other priests could identify those who are participants in this. Just truly disturbing news of what's taken place, and this is on grand scale. This isn't an isolated thing. This has happened throughout the years, where these priests are moved from city to city, potentially back to other parts of the country. This to me is one of those crimes that are committed against humanity, against children, and it's just truly disturbing, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, you're absolutely right. I think the one thing the Trump administration has done, it without that, I don't think the sort of I can't really think of an adjective to describe the revulsion that I feel on this, and it's a statement to the obvious. And people often say to me, "Look, you don't cover this sort of stuff," and no, generally we don't. But there are reasons why we don't deal with that, but it doesn't mean we're not appalled by this behavior. And absolutely, there's no doubt this is the tip of a gigantic iceberg. I mean, we've had situations in the UK and Ireland for quite a few years where these sort of outrageous behavior and has been exposed, not to this extent by any stretch. I mean, to have over 300 members of a clergy. And it goes on and says, of course, and it's absolutely true, there was 1,000 victims identified, but the chances are there's countless more. I mean, it could be double, treble, who knows, quadruple the amount of people. I mean, as they say, some victims are going to be afraid to come forward. Some are so deeply traumatized that they'll never come forward. Some victims undoubtedly are no longer with us. And it's just, and when they said we subpoenaed and reviewed 500,000 pages of internal documents, excuse me, it begins to put in context the extent of this problem. And this is one enormous but small problem amongst a sea of massive problems. And if there's one thing that has to come about, this all has to come out into the open, because it's the one thing, I think, more than anything, that will wake people up. All the people who just refuse to accept all the financial tyranny and the geopolitical tyranny and everything that's gone on, they're not going to turn the blind eye to this. They're going to go, hang on, what the hell's going on? And it's a way of waking people up. And increasingly, I think you're absolutely right. We'll see more and more of these ginormous icebergs coming to the surface. And of course, it's true as well. You know, loads of records might have been lost in this case, might have been destroyed. We have no way of actually really getting to the bottom of exactly how many people, you know, were abused and the extent of the abuse. And you know, they say over 300 members of a clergy. I mean, it is staggering to think of the extent and how many decades this has gone on. And you know, at some point this has to. And I'm sorry to say, whether people in the Catholic Church have a problem with this, well, that's their problem. I don't care, you know. And it's not just the Catholic; all religious abuse has gone on. It's not just Catholicism that's the problem. It has to be brought into the public domain, and you know how this is handled and how it's dealt with. You know, people need to be adjudicated. They need to, and you know, for the crimes they've committed, the punishment needs to be commensurate with what they've done. Because, I mean, you know, as I say, there isn't an adjective from my perspective that I think is suitable. I mean, there's a lot I could use, and there's a lot of very choice words I could use, but you know what? It doesn't even come close to you know, discussing just how utterly deplorable, despicable, and just, you know, it's you know, there isn't a word. I don't think any word I use could come close. But you know, it said the grand jury scrutinised abuse allegations in dioceses that minister to more than half the state's 3.2 million Catholics. So the question is, just how massive is this? If they've uncovered one thing, we just have no way of getting to the bottom of it, because there's things that could have happened 60, 70, 80, 50 years ago. The people who committed the crimes are no longer with us, and the people who were abused might no longer be with us either. So, but the important thing is that the public becomes aware of this. I know it's pretty horrific, and for some people, it's going to be very painful to have to you know, see this, because they may have, you know, had similar experiences and they largely buried it and didn't want to ever come to the fore, and they've tried to forget about it. Of course, this is going to open up all the wounds for them, but I think it's extremely important that that these matters are dealt with. And the other thing is this statute of limitation on these alleged crimes. I'm sorry, this has to stop.
Yes.
You cannot have this statute of limitations. So, oh, well, this happened 50, 60, whatever years ago. Let's just pretend it's not a problem. And, you know, and the legal system just decides that, you know, we're not going to deal with it. And then the other thing is, oh, well, you know, this has gone on for so long. You know, we found that people are too old to be prosecuted. I'm sorry, absolutely not. You know, these are just making excuses for despicable crimes that, you know, cannot be brushed under the carpet, and excuses made about statutes of limitation and people being too old. It's just not acceptable. And the question, of course, comes about is, how was this covered up for so long? I mean, are we seriously trying to suggest to me that these 1,000+ victims and these 300 members of the Catholic clergy, that somehow all this was contained and no one ever raised questions, no one ever complained, no one ever legally went to, you know, and said, look, I want to take out a prosecution against this, I want this investigated? Are we seriously supposed to believe none of this ever happened? I'm sorry, I don't believe it. So the question therefore comes in, who else has been covering up this systematic abuse that has gone on for decades? And because there's got to be people somewhere, because I just simply don't believe no one reported it. And, you know, did people go and they were discouraged from doing so? Were they actually threatened to not pursue things? We don't know, and we've got no way of knowing. But yeah, the more these cases are exposed globally, it's one of the most important things that happen, because I think it's one of the real things that will wake a load of people up and say, well, okay, it's going on inside the Catholic Church or religions. It's going on inside Hollywood. It's going on inside every walk of life. And the sooner it comes out and is exposed, then I think it will go a long way to waking a lot of people up and making them go, hang on, enough's enough. Because we know, I mean, as much as, from my own personal perspective, as deplorable as all the wars we've ever faced on this planet, and all the economic carnage and everything, when it comes down to the systematic abuse of children, women, and men, for that matter, that is on a whole different level, and it's a whole different perspective that we have to take on it. And I applaud the fact that these things are becoming in the public domain, and for that, I think we have to thank the Trump administration for doing so. And we just have to hope that this is just the tip of an iceberg, and more of this comes to the fore. And there needs to be accountability. And frankly, I don't care what happens to the Catholic Church or anyone else in the process. At some point there's going to have to be accountability on some level for what's going on, and sweeping under the carpet as it has been for decades. Those days have gone, and I just hope that I hope these stories give people courage of conviction to come forward and say, look, this happened to me. And maybe if there's people do, it will help to get investigations open. But again, the big headache is, how the hell do you manage these investigations when it's this enormous? I mean, as we said, 500,000 pages of documents that were subpoenaed and reviewed. I mean, it shows the extent of the abuse, and if you extrapolate that across the entire United States, you extrapolate that across, okay, the UK is a small country, but let's say Europe and the rest of the world in the process. It's an enormous undertaking, but it has to be done, and it has to happen as much as anything else to give some dignity to the victims and what they've suffered, and they've suffered in silence. And who knows what damage it has done to them. We talk about military personnel and post-traumatic stress disorder, and how they've had mental health problems because of it. Well, the same is applicable to these people, and they've grown up. Probably a lot of them have grown up in silence about this and the damage it will have done to them in the process. So, yeah, more power to the elbow of these investigations, and this disgusting behaviour, which is being polite, has got to be exposed, and it has to come to an end. And it's one chapter in humanity's history that everybody should be fully aware of.
Yeah, you're right, Paul, in terms of finding the right words. I think this defines us as a society. Do we pretend to ignore these things? Do we pretend to follow if this doesn't impact me, that I'm not concerned? And my prayers are out there for the victims, right? Because they're the ones who potentially are dealing with this for the rest of their lives and how they're impacted from this. But I think at the bare minimum is that there does need to be conversations in the open that people need to bring forth to the congregation, to specifically to the Vatican, to say specifically, obviously, you've known the history of this. You've known. This article goes on to state that Pope Francis himself summoned the entire bishops' conference to Rome after he said that he made grave errors in judgment in the case of Barros. And I believe Barros was convicted in Chile that he'd actually observed some of the abuse of happening of children and ignored it. And I think since then he's been removed. I think those questions need to be answered, Paul, in order for this to move forward, to hold those responsible, those accountable. But for us to potentially ignore this as a society and not talk about it, at some point we will be held accountable for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There needs to be the world in general needs to be able to say to these victims, you can come forward and discuss it with the appropriate authorities, and not feel that because it's a sad fact, but quite often people who are abused feel ashamed, and they have
feel
absolutely
you're right, absolutely.
what
did I do?
and they have absolutely nothing at all to feel ashamed. I mean, but I can only say, thank God I never experienced anything like that in my life, and I can't even begin to put myself in the minds of those who have, and I wouldn't even pretend to, because it's an insult to them to try and even do that. All we could say is, people need to be given the opportunity, and I think the floodgates need to open. And if it destroys religions or the Catholic Church in the process, well, I'm sorry, that's just has to happen. I mean, we can't have this covering things up. I mean, we had clear indications of abuse inside Hollywood. We've had abuse inside the entertainment industry, and the list goes on and on and on. And that's not just in the US; it's also became obvious in the UK as well. And people in these positions of authority have committed unspeakable crimes against minors, and not just minors, of course, adolescents and adults in the process. And this has to end, because it's a scourge on humanity, and that has to end. And undoubtedly it hasn't ended. I'm not saying, I don't know. I don't think it's as bad as it was, say, 70 years ago, but I'm certain it still goes on. And every person who suffers this anywhere in the world, it has to end. And everything that needs to be done to make that happen. If we talk about international cooperation, well, if that doesn't get nations of the world to cooperate with each other and work, and if someone's wanted for extradition in another country and there's evidence, extradite them, make them stand trial, and let's make an example of these disgusting, despicable, and they're not even subhuman. I mean, there's no word to describe it. So let's work it, have an international cooperation to deal with this problem and address it, and that has to happen. And I hope that it most certainly does. I don't want us to go through this big paradigm shift and the world to change, and these kind of deplorable crimes to go unaccounted for, and a large amount of humanity remains unaware of what's going on, because the extent of it, I think, would terrify people if they actually knew just how bad it was. And certainly, if you look at the amount of people who've committed these sort of crimes against adults as well, and everything else has gone on, I think it would stagger people, the extent of it. It's just probably off scale from any of our comprehension. So, yeah, I just hope that this does happen, because I think it's part of the sort of healing process for humanity across the world, that this has to happen. Yeah,
absolutely. Paul, what else is on your radar? Let's shift gears a little bit. Any other topics you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, where the hell did you go after that?
I know, right?
Yeah, it's just it's a bit tough. I mean, one thing I think was interesting that came to light, which talked about sort of lawmakers in the US are seeking to summon this constitutional convention, and they're looking to introduce amendments restricting the power of the federal government, which I think we'd all agree would make sense. I mean, it says, apparently the US was 3 or 4 years away from the next convention, but the US is failing and to address the existing problems. And I think, needs to be this idea of a convention of states. And it's the state legislatures that themselves have to call from it. And I think it's either 2/3 or 3/4 of the states to call for it before it happens. Now, apparently, you might be able to correct me, but I think the last constitutional convention took place 230 years ago.
Yeah, that is correct, according to this article I just pulled up from The Guardian.
I mean, yes. I think it was, I read somewhere recently about this, and of course, the argument is, and I think the question was, they collect all this huge amount of taxes and they still borrow all this additional money, and, what's going on in that regard. I think the whole idea that there should be term limits for Congress and Senate, and then for the UK Parliament, I absolutely agree. I think there should be term limits on federal office holders, and that's for across the board, because that would impinge on their power and their ability to stay in long term and cause damage. You've got someone who's in the Senate and Congress for decades. I think that's a huge problem. I think if you have term limits, it means people's ability to influence and subvert the process, the process, the Constitution, everything else would be massively diminished. So I think there are important things. They need to talk about a balanced budget term. As you said, term limits. They've talked about repealing the 17th Amendment, which returns the election of senators to state legislatures instead of direct election. And the kind of list goes on. But I think there are important ideas that You know, I'm not saying they should rewrite the US Constitution, and destroy the protection of rights, but I think there are things that need to be taken into account. And I do think term limits need to be applied. I don't know what your feeling is on that, but I think that's a big issue. And I think that should happen in all Western governments.
And yeah, in terms of the freedom, the liberty, the original concept of a federal government, to see where it is today and the fact that states potentially could be losing rights, and the battle that states have, at the federal level, time and time again. I challenge the fact that, how many times have we heard legislatures that we're gonna go there, we're gonna have term limits, we're gonna do all these things. And then you take a look, Paul, at the number of days, the number of working days that our legislatures serve in DC. I think they work like 100 days, maybe even not even 100 days, like 75 days out of the course of a year they actually have in legislation. So why do we need a full-time federal government? There's so many changes that could be made, and then more importantly, preserving the right of individual liberty, individual freedoms, that somewhere that message has gotten lost along the way, where too many people had a great discussion about this yesterday with a couple of friends, is the fact that why do so many people turn to the government for answers? Why is it that people would not put more faith and trust in humanity, of taking care of the poor, taking care of those in need, versus a federal bureaucracy program, and to preserve those things, to get back to the states' rights, to get back to individual rights and liberty? um, we are quickly approaching a defining moment, because I think there's more discontent now than ever with the political process in America, and that be whether you're a Democrat or Republican. We have a very outdated system, and I believe that system no longer reflects individual liberty. We live currently in a political system that special interests, corporations, and big money defines who gets elected and who gets to Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And something needs to change, Paul. Our system is very broken.
Yeah, and it's the same in the UK. I mean, let's not just point the finger at the US. I think it's true of the huge, vast bulk of Western nations. But to have the last constitutional convention 230 years ago is proof of the pudding, because you need to have a constitutional convention where everyone gets around, behaves like adults, discusses the issues, and actually comes to some sensible agreement on how things need to be slightly tweaked to make it fit for purpose in the 21st century, because clearly it's not, and things have been subverted, and it's one, people talk about how do you resolve big problems in the US. Well, I think this is one of those examples. That's how you begin to resolve problems, by looking at things like that, resolving the issues, and making the federal government, making governance full stop far more fit for purpose in the 21st century than because clearly it's failed the US, it's clearly failed the UK, and it's failed countless other nations. And there does need to be some understanding that, but I think there's, the question is, are there still too many people who have a vested interest to keep this system going the way it is, even though it's abysmally fails for the average American, the average British person, etc., etc. And but there definitely needs to be moves made to address these problems and say, okay, yeah, as what was said, we collect 1.5 trillion in tax money, yet we still borrow 680 billion. Why are we doing that? There needs to be far more accountability for actions that are made. And that, if you want to talk about draining the swamp and resolving problems, that is a clear example of how it will have to come about. And at some point, however the political system unfolds in the new paradigm, and I think, I don't think the Republicans and the Democrats or Labour and Conservative will exist as they do now. There'll be certainly change in the political system. But at the end of the day, we still have to go, okay, how is a nation going to be governed? It needs to be governed a lot less, with a lot less stringency. That we need to have light government, not heavyweight draconian government, but certainly there needs to be some element of governance. And how do we address this problem? And we need to start thinking about that and making those changes, and that will go a long way to removing the corruption that exists, because clearly there's no doubt that there are people inside the US political system and the UK political system who are causing major problems, and the fact they've been around for decades and or considerable period of time are a big roadblock and an obstruction in that process. Now, people say, "Oh yeah, well we can vote these people out." Well, yes, that's true, you can, and that is one answer to the problem, but it doesn't resolve the overall problems that exist. And this is why I think there's a bit of an oversimplification of what draining the swamp means. And it doesn't just mean getting rid of these people. It means making fit for purpose all the instruments that are in place that were supposed to, from 230 years ago, this is how governance was supposed to work. You can guarantee the people who came about with the last constitutional convention will be looking now going, well, that all went spectacularly wrong. But after over 230 years, of course it will be, because think about how we used to live 230 years ago to how we live now. It's an inevitability. It's not fit for purpose. And, I think these are sensible, mature discussions that has to happen. And, and we hope from the US perspective that does come about, because I think that will make a big difference in the long run.
Absolutely.
Provided people have a mature, adult type attitude to it. And that is the big problem, because there's no doubt, the Republicans and the Democrats, there's plenty of people on both sides of the House who resist, as they say, they resist anything that's impinging on their power. They don't want to see things change because it's a gravy train they don't want to stop. Well, the gravy train's going to stop. And the other situation is, okay, if we remove all these people from office, or by however that happens, there's going to be this enormous void that needs to be filled with people who can govern a country, who are capable of making decisions in the best interests of the American or the British people. You can't just get rid of them all and say, right, the country will govern itself. I know there's a lot of people who think that's that utopian view that everyone can just govern themselves. Well, in the future, yeah, I think we'll have more empowerment to do things for ourselves, but that can't happen overnight. You can't switch, from one system to another. It takes a period of time. You've got to adjust people's perspective. Too many people are totally reliant on the states. Like you say, you have conversations with people and say, why are we so dependent? Well, on the system. Well, people have been made to have to be dependent, but to change that's going to take a long time. You've got to change people's mindsets, and so therefore, even if we do move radically in a different direction, it's going to take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. I can't put a time frame on it. So we're going to have governance that adjusts accordingly. And of course, if we change that, the Constitution in the US is going to have to, change to some extent to reflect those changes. But it needs to be done in a mature way that benefits all the American people, and not, the so-called, well, it's not even 1%. It's, it's the deep state, the cabal, who are resistant to this change. But I'm sure, I don't know, I can't speak, but I don't know many people in the UK political system who I think have any real interest in bettering the lives of people. There are some of them, and I'm sure there's some of them in the US, and I'm sure people will know plenty who are. So they're the basis for change. But that is a big problem that needs to be addressed, and that's why I say don't trivialize what this process is. It's a huge, monumental shift of attitude, and there's, I'm not being rude, but there's plenty of people who are aware of what's going on and understand, but but equally, of how are they going to approach the future? What do they think is going to happen? And that they're going to probably have to marry their expectations with the reality of how things are going to unfold, because as awake as they are, there's plenty of people who don't know anything. And when all these changes happen, how are they going to react? Are they going to be resistant to the change? And how do you approach that? So you never look at the world through your own eyes and your own understanding. Look at it from the lowest common denominator of someone who knows nothing, and then try and understand how you bring about that change. And then you start to appreciate the severity and the enormity of the challenges we face. But if you want to have the world and you have freedom, freedom comes at a price, and it's ultimately enormous self-responsibility, and that's the self-responsibility of all humanity, and it's something we have to take very seriously, and I'm sure people will do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Paul, thank you so much for joining today. Please share with our listeners how they can learn more about your work at the Series Report. Please go ahead.
Well, thanks, CJ, and a pleasure as ever. It's always great to come on Rogue Money or Rogue News now. And we dealt with some subjects I don't normally discuss. So, and I think this is probably a better forum for us to do things like that. But yeah, in terms of, we're obviously the SiriusReport.com. That's SIRUS. We've got the website. We've got the Twitter account, which we obviously use quite a bit more than we used to. And yes, we have our subscription service, and you can read all the details on the site. And the things we discuss on Rogue News, we don't discuss in the podcast, and we go into huge more detail about finance, geopolitical events, etc. And we do 5 of those equivalent a week, and I think we've done 477 now.
Wow.
So,
wow.
And you have access to all of those. We've had some people who subscribed who've gone back and listened to every single one of them, which I think was incredible. They probably deserve a number of gold medals to put up listening to me for 477 episodes. But no, it's a pleasure. And if you want to do tomorrow, I'm happy to do tomorrow as well, if that suits you.
Yeah, I will definitely take you up on that, Paul. I know our fans, our listeners love hearing your perspectives, and obviously I love it when I get the opportunity to listen as well. So for our fans, thank you so much for listening in. Please make sure to leave comments in the comment sections, like, subscribe, share in your network. Just to let everyone know today's programming. Again, I will follow up with the Crypto Boys to see if they're going to be doing a cryptocurrency show later on. And then also tonight, just a courtesy FYI, I'll be posting it as well. We are doing a special broadcast tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll have the opportunity to be interviewing Erin Elizabeth with Health Nut News, and really love Erin's work that she does, exposing so much at Health Nut News. So I've been trying to get her on for a while. So tonight looks like we're going to be able to make that happen. That's 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So Paul, thank you again so much for joining this morning. And
real pleasure. Yeah.
All right. Take care, everyone. Enjoy your day. This is CJ in London. Paul, we're over and out. Take care, everyone.